Nigel has shown himself astonishingly indifferent to Parliament, hasn't he? He's very rarely there, doesn't do very much when he is there. He is now a Prime Minister who will simply not have serious parliamentary experience.
Part of the problem he has is because there's only four of us, and as a party leader perceived to be the leader of the opposition, despite only having four MPs, he has to do huge amounts of stuff.
At every stage, Nigel has quarrelled. A Prime Minister is not a one-man show. You don't really see Darren Grimes as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
No, but you might see Richard Tice. In this last year, the people who have fallen by the wayside are those who have no conception of team play. Hello and welcome to David's Starkey Talks. I'm delighted to be coming for the second time to interview David in the start of what's been a very, very eventful summer was the last time. Since that time, I have actually become a member elected to the board of Reform UK. So clearly I'm a terribly important person, almost as important as David.
I carefully avoid being on the board of anything.
But I'm helping put work. I'm doing a whole series of events at conference as are you. I've noticed from the programme. But I'm sure we've got plenty to discuss on reform and many other things. So the first question isn't about us, but is about what has been happening in the Labour Party and Angela Rayner, taxes, and the strange ethics scandal she's managed to tie herself up in. And is that because she's done something wrong, or it's just the perception of something wrong?
Doing something wrong by whose standards? I suspect in terms of ordinary law and ordinary public morality, she hasn't done anything wrong. But in terms of her own standards, in terms of the rants that she launched against Tory sleaze and Tory scum.
The Nadeem Sadari, for example.
Exactly. She is hung as ever, or blown up by her own petard. It's very simple. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And this is the great problem with the left. The left, you may remember, there's a wonderful phrase of probably one of the least moral politicians in British history, Harold Wilson, declaring that the Labour Party is a moral crusade, or it's nothing. And of course, it's a lie. It is a parade of morality. It's a parade of public morality coupled with ordinary human behaviour. And the trouble is, the left is a natural living hypocrisy. Interestingly enough, the idea of a party of sustained hypocrisy is, you will remember, Disraeli in his radical phrase in the 1830s, calling the Conservative Party that. But in fact, it is the Labour Party, because it affects this higher morality. It sees itself as good. But then, like so many people who see themselves as good, they effectively license themselves to do bad. And Rayner is in exactly that position. And I think, again, we need to scrutinise, Gawain, very carefully what she actually did. I think there are two things that scream at you. She is saying, oh, I took legal advice and I followed legal advice. What we need to know is what her instructions to her lawyers were, because the only reason you take legal advice on trusts, on tax, on stamp duty is if you want to avoid it, if you want to lower it. I don't think that Angela Rayner's, as it were, instructions to her lawyers were, please find the method by which I can most honestly pay the most tax on this transaction. In other words, she began her instructions, and this again is what Laurie Magnus, the magnate who is in charge of our public morality, will have to find out, if he possibly can, what her instructions were. And yet, of course, the entire rhetoric of this government, from the very beginning, in opposition, even before it was in the government, was we've all got to pay absolutely the maximum amount of tax we owe, and any attempt at reducing it is wicked, immoral, is the prerogative of Tories and the rich. That's the problem she's got us into. The other thing, and I feel very strongly about this, it's the use of her child. She's using her child as this is the disabled son. She's using him as a shield in exactly the same way that Keir Starmer used his son and his son's A levels as a shield when he was actually using Lord Ali's flat as his campaign headquarters in the run up to the last election. This shameless, oh, we don't put our family in the public eye, and yet the moment it's convenient to hide behind one of them, you do it. As we've again seen repeatedly with Starmer, we know more about his family than almost any other prime ministerial family. You know, the fact that he got a disabled brother, that his mother had some sort of terrible, perhaps motor neuron disease or whatever it was, that his father was a bloody toolmaker, but constantly using them as protection. But the worst thing of all is, of course, the financial element of it. Because of the negligence of our NHS, she and her then husband received a large settlement on behalf of the child, held in trust. And she used that money to buy herself out of the house in Ashton under Lyme so she could leverage herself into a super elegant flat in the smartest bit of Hove on which an enormous amount of public money has just been spent so that she could be seen, lounging around on a lilo in the sea with cocktails and a vape. That is the morality of Labour. That's the picture. And no wonder she was ashen-faced when she sat down behind the Prime Minister with tears in her eyes, making a perfect symmetry, if you remember, with when he was last sitting there, and Rachel Reeves had tears in her eyes. And the Prime Minister now looks like a figure out of classical mythology, and the solemn male surrounded by weeping women. It's a wonderful parody. But Gawain, you were advertising your role in the very heart of this absolutely opposite party that has never ever done anything wrong, that stands as a monument against the wicked corruption of both Tories and Labour. Shall we just flick forward to when Nigel is Prime Minister, thanks to all of your efforts? He's going to be subject to this scrutiny too, isn't he?
Yes.
How's he going to stand up to it? Because his living arrangements are pretty complex too, aren't there? There are different women, there are children by different women, there are houses, more than one house. How is that going to stand to the scrutiny, bearing in mind the evidence now that it will have brought down at least a deputy prime minister, if not a prime minister?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I hark back to this idea of the government being absolutely Puritan on the idea that everybody pay as much tax as they possibly can. I think back to Lord Salisbury, who, as Prime Minister, said that it was every Englishman's right and duty to withhold as much tax as they could from the government.
That was when we didn't spend very much.
Well, this is very true, but it's a very different attitude. And Nigel himself, he's been 30 years at the top of his particular tree. He has been investigated and scrutinised for decades. I think it's going to be very hard for anybody to find anything new. But the main point about Nigel is he stands there in front of you with a cigarette in one hand, a pint of beer in the other hand, and feet of clay. And he's never, ever pretended.
He's human. He's human. He doesn't make any pretense
He
at
doesn't
super
say,
virtue.
look at me, I'm better than you, ever. He's never had this moralistic side to him. And therefore, because he forgives us our failings, we are more minded to forgive him his.
You're making him sound dangerously like Jesus Christ.
No, good Lord, no. It's, no, he's far more a very naughty boy than he is a Messiah.
But I think it's really important we stress this, that what Nigel represents is the antithesis of the politics of virtue. And it's the politics of, this is what we forget. It's virtuous politicians who do damage. It's virtuous politicians who've got vast ideals, which they impose usually by the cruelest and the most brutal methods, thinking as always, of course, that essential element of Marxism, the end justifies the means. So Great. Can we now move on? I don't think Angela Rayner actually deserves all that much attention, to be quite blunt. But I've got another question I want to ask you again, continuing from frauds in public life, which is intended as a segue from Angela Rayner and not from Nigel. There's somebody now around. In other words, the newly elected leader of the Greens, who is consciously modelling himself as the antithesis of Nigel, isn't he? This extraordinary figure called, well, at the moment he's called Zack Polanski. I gather he was born rather more boringly David Paulden, but he's reinvented himself. How do you see him performing as the leader of the Greens? How do you, I mean, do you see anything in his notion that he is a kind of mirror image of Nigel, but the good mirror image, with Nigel being the bad boy?
He is utterly convinced of his own rectitude. Utterly convinced. I found myself in a very awkward position a few months ago on a TV panel with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Emma Reynolds, and Zack Polanski. And I found myself a Reform spokesman defending the Labour economics spokesman from the sheer lunacy of Polanski's economics. He just screams billionaires and millionaires at people and demands that everybody pay 80% tax because he's a good guy. And it's a little bit like that famous sketch of Are We the Baddies? One begins to feel that they certainly are. He is a very performative politician.
Well, can we look at his background? He is a former Harley Street quack. He This is the important thing to understand. He's a former hypnotist. He used to hypnotize women and persuade them, if they thought about it a lot, their tits would grow bigger.
This is true.
Is this not essentially his approach to the economy? He wants to hypnotize us all and persuade us that there's a magic money tree, that the vast bulk of the wealth in the country is held by a handful of secretive billionaires. If only their wealth were generally circulated, we would all live happily ever after and not have to do a day's work. It's just another form of magic, isn't it?
It is, but worse than that, not only would we live happily ever after, we wouldn't be able to move from A to B because it'd have banned cars, and the electricity, there would be no power. I suppose we could go back to horses and make our own energy
There'll
that
be
way.
no children because we'd all be transgendered, probably compulsorily.
I think compulsory transgenderism is not actually one of his policies as of yet.
No. But there is policy development, as there is with reform. I'm sure there is the equivalent of a green board working on this even as we're now. But I am mocking, but it's true, isn't it?
You only have to see his performances in the London Assembly, and they are short, bullet point rants. And this, I think, he thinks he has learned from Farage, but he doesn't do it in the same way. One, there's almost never, ever any humour. There's no scintilla of self-deprecation because he is so certain of his own moral purity, and it is the as you were saying about Angela Rayner and the Labour Party, is this idea, because we know we are morally good, everything we do is morally good, even when we do things that are bad. They must be good because we're good, and that sense of entitled hypocrisy absolutely runs through everything Zack Polanski says. He made some claim about me, and he used it in his campaign. Said, I proved that reform are just funded by billionaires and millionaires. And I pointed out, well, actually, most of our money comes from the £25 membership from our 230,000 members. But that's not registered on an LCOM, so it doesn't exist in his head because he only sees things in such simplistic ways. It's good, but I think for his base in the Green Party, that suits their mindset. It will not do him any harm electorally.
What do you think? Again, I know you're very interested in this kind of electoral nitty gritty. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, do you think that we'll now see an alliance, because they make exactly the same noises, between they all believe in the magic monetary? Do you think the Fruit and Nut Party, Sultana and Corbyn, is going to go effectively into an electoral pact with the Greens?
I don't think they will, at least initially. I think they'll wait for the first round of elections before they do that. But there are times between now and then, such as the Welsh and Scottish elections next year, the council elections next year, for them to have an idea of where they stand against each other. Um, so I don't think it's going to be quick. It's not going to be like the SDP and the Lib Dems, who actually, and the Liberals, who literally within a couple of months of the foundation of the SDP had done a deal. I don't think it's going to be the case. Jezbollah has different views and it has a much bigger clout. I think one thing, I do believe that Polanski's Greens will save their seats in Brighton, in Bristol, in a couple of other cities, in urban places. But I suspect the seats they have won in Herefordshire and in Norfolk, I suspect their hardcore economic attitudes will turn off a lot of the slightly uh,
Blue-green.
Barber-wearing middle-class mobbies. Yeah, I don't think they're going to be quite so happy. I think the Herefordshire and Norfolk seats that the Greens hold now may well be put into question by his approach.
That's very interesting. So I think we'll see, I'm sure you're right. We'll see again. What's going on at the moment is this extraordinary redrawing of the electoral map, isn't it? As the actual electoral coalitions, in other words, the kinds of electors supporting the various political parties, undergo this extraordinary kaleidoscopic shift, which we've seen since Boris Johnson in the 2019 election. But just looking at the bigger picture, how much do you think the Green stroke fruit and nut party or our party, your party, whatever it is, combination is going to do damage to the Labour vote? I mean, I would suspect a very great deal, don't you?
I do think it's going to be extremely damaging. Though I take one issue with I think what's now become commonplace thinking, and that is that we have fragmentation of politics. Complete. It's no longer a two-party state. It's da 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 da. I suspect we're not seeing fragmentation so much as a realignment. So on the right, reform looks like it's going to take the Tories out of Scotland and Wales. The Conservatives therefore cease to be a national party and they cease to have a purpose, really. On the left, I think if they do, the Greens and the left wing of the Labour Party and Jezbollah, fruit and nuts come together, then you can see a replacement of Labour. One of the things in this study that came out yesterday I thought was fascinating is they looked at the 12 to 16-year-olds and the ones who Labour are sort of gerrymandering in to vote at the next election. Because Labour thinks that there's having dominated schools, they will collect a lot of votes in that segment. But right now, in that group of the 16, 17-year-olds right now, I think it's 23% Labour, 22% Reform, 21% Corbyn. That doesn't include the Greens. The Greens are another 10%. So there is something going on there. But the 20 seats with the largest 12 to 16-year-olds, the ones who will be voting next time, are almost all with large Islamic minorities.
We better call them Muslim, haven't we? We better call them Muslim rather than Islamic. Yeah.
Yes, okay, Muslim, but that community has more children than the settled community. It just does. So, of course, the relative impact of youth vote that Labour brought in thinking they would vote for them, they may have created an absolute monster with this sort of constitutional gerrymandering. And I think it's extremely worrying.
I agree. Can we, on the subject of the Constitution and the much enhanced role that Nigel is playing, can we shift to Nigel in America? It sounds like the title of a bad novel, doesn't it? Nigel in America. And to an extent, I think his experience before the committee of the House of Representatives, the Justice Committee, was rather less happy than he'd hoped, wasn't it? I mean, he he put up a reasonably good account of himself, but he was also thoroughly roasted very effectively, I think, by two Democrat representatives. How well prepared do you think he was? I mean, he moves in the America that's familiar to him, doesn't he? He moves in the America of Mar-a-Lago. He moves in the America of Palm Beach, of MAGA, of that section of the Republican Party. But of course, Congress is bitterly Congress is bitterly divided in the same way our House of Commons is. And there he was exposed to the full red in tooth and claw Democrat, wasn't he? And I thought they took quite large chunks of flesh out of him.
Well, I think, and they were mostly focusing on supposed Russia links and his so-called support for Putin, which he doesn't. Whilst it may have played to the Carol Cadwalader byline Times crowd, I don't think it would have much cut through beyond that, because again, these things have been said here before, they've been done before, and it hasn't actually had any serious impact upon him, because at base, it's just not true. And the fact that he's able to sort of deal with these attacks, I think, reasonably well, is that
there's nothing to them. There's no evidence.
But in the theatre that is the congressional hearing, yes, I suspect it wasn't ideal.
As you know, I am, although I remain old fool that I am, a member of the Conservative Party, I am very reform friendly, as you well know. So everything that I'm saying is done out of friendly criticism rather than unfriendly criticism. The other thing that did strike me was, of course, that Nigel wasn't actually very well prepared. In other words, his speech was characteristic of the kind of slightly stumpy speech that he is good at. But in a formal committee, it doesn't actually work very well, as you saw with the kind of speeches, very detailed, the product of lots and lots of researchers working on them. You don't think those senators know the detail of Nigel's politics or British life themselves. They have huge teams of researchers doing the work for them. So this was carefully rehearsed. But carefully researched political theatre. Now, Nigel, it struck me just listening late last night to the links to America. Nigel actually had a means by which he could and should have responded. In other words, what he should have said to those Democrats was, you wanted to do in America exactly what Starmer is doing here. If you remember, Kamala Harris's running mate actually said in one of the vice presidential debates, the protections of the First Amendment don't extend to hate speech. In other words, the Democrats have been trying to bring in America, as this is exactly whatever he was called, I forget his name, but the white chap rather than the black who was interrogating Farage, that when he was talking about the limitations on the First Amendment, what the Democrats were trying to do was to replicate exactly the kind of limitations on freedom of speech that we have here. Because remember, all of these pernicious movements in Britain, Black Lives Matter, transgenderism, the whole business of critical race theory, they all begin in France, then they're amplified in America through American academic and political life, and then they're reflected back here. Now, if Nigel had been master of that brief, he could have taken control of that committee. And the big point that I want to put to you, Gawain, and I'm delighted to hear about your being on the board. Nigel is going to have to grasp policy, the actual detail of policy. And this is something he has never fully done before. He's a brilliant, reflexive politician. He's an extraordinary reader of the public mood. I know I've worked with him in the days when before I was decided to be too dangerous for talk radio, for GB News and whatever. I've worked with him. He's a brilliant interviewer, broadcaster, a natural sympathy and all the rest of it. But policy, the detail of policy, has never been his strong point.
In response to that, David, I think the change in Farage between last year, about this time, and now is very significant. A year ago, he was the past master disruptor in chief. It's what he's brilliant at. It's what he's done for years. But if you look at him now, with these major set-piece press conferences he's had over the last few weeks, on the crime and immigration, stuff of that sort, from what I understand, he's spending a day to 2 days preparing for each one of those events with the facts, with the figures, with the solidity. And unlike any other politician in Britain, after the end of his speech, questions. He answers every single question that's thrown at him. He gets a list of every journalist that wants to ask the question, and he answers every single one. And it doesn't have to be about the subject matter in the room, and though most of them are, of course, but he will answer things on across the board.
But some of the answers have to be corrected quite quickly afterwards, don't they?
Very, very rarely. And yes,
No, well, actually, on big issues rather frequently.
on the subject of the press conference, the du jour, he has a mastery of the figures and all the rest of it. But you're right. I mean, a congressional office is there are more staffers working on policy and prep if for a single American senator than there are for the entirety of reform. And that is a problem of growth, a speed of growth, and frankly, a problem of money. But if you look at right now, if you would go on the Reform website and look at the jobs available page, we are employing policy analysts. It's not there yet, but it's certainly in hand. So whilst you are right that historically Nigel's strongest suit has not been policy detail, I think he is becoming or has become acutely aware that he's likely to be the next prime minister. And as such, he has to, if not grow up, but take that responsibility with the absolute seriousness that it deserves and needs. And I think it's clear from his demeanour. This is something he's worked out for himself. He doesn't need to be advised that this is the case. He knows, and he knows deep in his heart and the depth of his soul that he has to master those briefs and get the policy work done and get the comprehension of it so he can answer with his quippery something very serious.
I'm delighted to hear you saying this. But two thoughts strike me. The first is bearing in mind the previous image of Nigel, the carefully cultivated one. Do you think it's actually possible to make that transition? I mean, as you know, the Nigel's image, and I'm going to use a cruel word because there's always been a slight touch of the spiv about it, hasn't there?
Okay.
You know, the ex-city boy, the fag hanging out of the corner of the Mac, the loud-coloured trousers, the slightly withered, nicotine-preserved look. You know, it does that translate into high seriousness?
Um, no, and I think that is also changing. His sort of roused about past has definitely uh, been toned down to a great extent. There is a much more statesman-like approach he's taking. Now, the question is, can the country wear a change? Yes, I think they can.
The country needs a change.
Well, precisely, they need to change. But equally, the last thing you'd want to do, as we were saying earlier, the last thing you want to do is turn him into some sort of holier than thou figure. He has to retain that self-deprecation, that recognition of his own fallibility, whilst at the same time take the job that may well come into his hands of being our prime minister and basically being responsible for the millions of people here, their livelihoods, their life, their health, their education, the whole works. And also, of course, the worst thing a prime minister will ever have to do is make a decision that sends our young men to die. That is utterly serious. And it has actually, I think, been taken lightly by a number of prime ministers over recent years. The sheer responsibility upon those shoulders. This is something, as a student of history, as you know he is, he takes extremely seriously. Now, does he have the team around him yet to help him get there? I'm not 100% sure, but it's definitely growing. That team is getting better and it is getting more serious. And the people I now see in the Orbat are people with a far greater depth of research, of policy work, But that's because we have to. This is our country, and if we make a mess of it, we will never be forgiven.
What I'd like to do, Gawain, I don't know whether you know, but I am heavily involved with actually one of those groups, namely the Prosperity Institute and the work of its remarkable young Director of Legal Affairs, effectively preparing the legislative program that Nigel will need, or any incoming government of the right will need, to sweep away the whole of the terrible Blairite state that has actually stopped even the heir of Blair, even our present Prime Minister Starmer, doing anything at all. But just what I'd like now to do again, we're not going to leave America, because clearly the model of somebody who had a second coming, and we've been talking very much about Nigel having a kind of second coming, is Donald Trump, isn't it? The difference between term one Trump and term two Trump. And obviously, one of the great differences of term two Trump is exactly the sort of preparation we've been talking about. That extraordinary moment when, after his very, very rapid and very unceremonious swearing in the rotunda of the Capitol building, he goes straight to the Oval Office, and Stephen Miller appears behind him, the Deputy Chief of Staff, with that great pile of executive orders. And immediately, at that moment, the process of a new government, of change, and actually the direct implementation of policy begins. Now, there is a problem, isn't there? In so many ways, I think the most obvious model so far, certainly the public model that Nigel has been using, is Trump. Now, there is a problem, isn't it, that American presidents can do things which English prime ministers can't, in just the same way that British prime ministers can do also things that American presidents can't. There's no equivalent to the executive order here. That's to say, fundamental change has to go through the machinery of Parliament. Now, Nigel has shown himself astonishingly indifferent to Parliament, hasn't he? And he's very rarely there. He doesn't do very much when he is there. I know life is made deliberately very difficult for him, but he is now a prime minister who will simply not have serious parliamentary experience, and he's shown no desire to use his seat in the House to acquire it. Don't you think this is a very serious criticism?
That is actually an interesting criticism and not one I've heard put in that way before. And I think it's a fair point. The part of the problem he has, and it is a reason but not an excuse. Part of the problem he has is because there's only four of us, and the sheer weight of pressure as a party leader, and as a party leader perceived to be the leader of the opposition, despite only having four MPs, uh, he has to do huge amounts of stuff. His time is chopped into 15-minute slots. He also has to raise them. He's the main fundraiser, and he's the main person on the box. He has other things he's maintaining international relations, all the stuff that a normal party leader does. But at the same time, he hasn't had 3 terms as a backbencher to get used to how Parliament works before he got there. And you are correct. But it won't just be him, of course, because to win, we need 400 seats. No more than 10 will have ever sat in the House before. So not only will the leader have no experience of Parliament or very little experience of parliamentary procedures or the rest of it, but his cabinet won't either. And nor will the junior ministers, and nor will the backbenchers. Nobody will.
This is a terrifying prospect.
It is. There are other paradigms. I mean, if you look at some of the countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had governments come in with absolutely no experience, and they actually did, in some cases, did a very good job indeed. I'm thinking of Mark Lara in Estonia and others. And so it's not impossible, but it's going to be hard.
But so equally, isn't there a problem? Now, you began by describing Nigel's multifarious activities. Isn't one of the reasons for that that he's never been able to work happily with anybody serious? In
I
other
don't
words,
think.
Well, there is. I'm afraid there's a lot of evidence, isn't there? I
Oh,
mean, if you
there's
go
evidence
right
that
back,
he
if you
moves
go
on.
right, but just let me finish. I've listened very patiently.
Yes,
Let me put the contrary case to you, because it really, as I said, we need this friendly debate. It needs to be in public, and we need to be as honest with each other, because we are contemplating, as you said, this extraordinary sea change in our politics. I know a little about the very early days of UKIP because, of course, the founder of UKIP, Alan Sked, was my colleague at LSE.
of course, yes.
And going right back, I mean, I too am tarred with the terrible Fabian brush. I was, I was a member of staff at LSE for 25 years. I survived, and with my opinions intact and everything else intact. But going right back to the days of Alan Sked and going through, the various transmogrifications of UKIP, Brexit, and everything else, at every stage, Nigel has quarrelled. Or other people have quarrelled with Nigel. In other words, a prime minister cannot do what you've just described Nigel as doing. A prime minister is not a one-man show, particularly as this is a government, the incoming government that we both desperately want to see, is a government that will have to do more radical and more difficult things in the face of uniform opposition from the Blob, from the Lords, from the academic establishment, from the legal establishment, whatever. That demands a team of weighty, serious people. I see, despite even your presence on the board, no sign of it. I mean,
Um,
you don't really see Darren Grimes as Chancellor of the Exchequer, do you?
no, but you might see Richard Tice, who does have an understanding of macroeconomics. There are other people. I think one of the things that is clear, you are right. Nigel has, over the years, fallen out with a number of people. I would put it to you that in a very small goldfish bowl that was UKIP and a slightly larger one that was the Brexit Party, um, the very nature of what it was then on the edge of uh, acceptability means that many of the people who grow within it are eccentric, to say best. And Nigel has always been much more of a pragmatist. I was involved myself in when poor old Goddard was removed, and it wasn't because of it was basically because Goddard couldn't take discipline. We didn't have the discipline to be the team player we needed, and it's the same in this last year. The people who have fallen by the wayside are those who have no conception of team play. Now, people accuse Nigel of that, but if I look around the people close to him right now, the people on the board, I've known him for 20 years. Paul Nuttall, who's the deputy chairman, has known him for, 15 years. David Bull since 2019. Andrew Reid, probably for 30 years. These are people who are good, solid, effective, dependable people. His personal press officer, Dan Dukes, 12 years.
Are they cabinet capacity?
Some of them certainly are.
I'm sorry. What is conspicuous about all of the people you mention is they have no public profile whatever. And you've only very recently acquired one.
It's only because I've only started going in the public in the last
No,
year
no, no, no,
since
no.
it was fired.
That's right. That's right. No, but I mean, do you, again? Sorry, this is the question. You've been elected to what is the key, the board of the party, which I suppose, if we were looking at it as a normal opposition party, would mean you would have, in usual circumstances, you would have been an MP and you would actually be a front bencher. Do you see yourself as having the capacity to become that? As you were saying, there is going to be very likely a complete clean sweep. There are going to be these newly baptized MPs.
Do I see myself in that role? Yes, I don't see why not. I'm not sure it's a role I'd want, but it's certainly a role I would do if requested and asked. And I think it's something I could do because I do have 20 years' experience in the European Parliament and elsewhere, working within the systems and around the systems. Um, but I think what's one thing, I'll give you an example. One of the fellows who's become a big issue in British politics in the last year is Zia Yusuf. Nobody knew his name a year ago, and these days he is everywhere and significant. And that is because the party promoted him, Nigel supported him. We have a capacity, because of the sheer greed of the media, to find anything reform related. If we find somebody good and effective that we trust, we think is capable in the area, say, of healthcare or education or transport or whichever major brief we're talking about, we have the capacity to bring that person to the public and make them a public figure before they're elected to the House of Commons, because after all, we don't have a general election for a while. So I think, and the other thing I would talk about there is when I was a 15-year-old, I could have told you the front benches of both major parties and probably some of the ministers of state. When I was a 25-year-old, the same, 35, the same, 45, the same. Today, I'm an addict of politics. I'm absolutely committed to it. I'm completely surrounded by it. I couldn't name you more than 6 members of the Tory front bench, or probably about 7 or 8 of the Labour front bench, and they're the government. So I don't think the country
They're
requires.
midgets. They're midgets.
They are. But I don't think the country now, right now, requires a full set of well-known figures. We don't have the Dennis Healeys, the Tony Crosslands. We don't have the Jim Pryors and the Lord Carringtons at this point. We don't, because you are right, they're midgets, and in part because of our membership of the European Union has meant there was no point in being in Parliament, and people of quality gave up getting involved. But I think that will change, and I think also suspect we do not expect all our figures to come bubbling up from our 230,000. I think we're going to go out very positively recruiting people of quality, of talent, and of ability, and bringing them on board. And as long as they are comfortable and solid with the broader teal agenda, as I call it, then if they have those abilities and talents, then they are for what is going to be, and as you put it, and as I think of it, this is going to be a great restoration project. This is the greatest political project possibly of our lifetime.
Oh, longer. No, no, Gawain, you underestimate. I mean, it is if what we're talking about
If we
happens,
succeed,
well, but if you are looking to 1832 or even to 1689 for something comparable in scale, because we can now see that what Blair did from 1997, what Blair and Brown did from 1997 onwards, was the equivalent of a slow burn French Revolution. In
correct.
its profound impact, not simply on law, not simply on the Constitution, but of course actually transforming the complexion, literally the complexion of our population. I'd like to conclude by just exploring a little bit the business of Zia Yusuf, not talking about his personality or whatever, which we've all seen in operation and we will have all formed our judgment of. But I want to explore his title, DOGE.
Yes.
Director of Governmental Efficiency. Now, we're talking now of something that is a direct imitation of what happened in the early days of the Trump presidency, of Elon Musk's role as head of DOGE. That role was a complete failure. It was a total failure. It damaged. Musk profoundly. Look at the share price of Tesla, and its sales has not recovered. And also, it achieved astonishingly little. He talked about tens, hundreds of billions. It saved a handful of billions. In other words, margins of error. I put it to you that the idea of governmental efficiency as actually saving very much money is simply misconceived. Look at local government, the area where reform is actually able to put something into practice at the moment, because is it 10 councils? I mean,
10 councils, yeah.
that you now control. If you actually look at what councils spend their money on, what they overwhelmingly spend their money on is 2 areas determined by the state, which is care for the elderly and ludicrous policies in relation to special needs children, the whole so-called business of SEND, which are gigantic amounts of money. In other words, local authorities can only make marginal differences. They can, of course, mishandle things shockingly badly, as Labour authorities tend to do, whether it's the matter of the grooming gangs and their relationships with that shady side of life on the one hand, or the gross financial mismanagement of, say, Birmingham on the other. But isn't it a terrible mistake to begin with a major policy initiative borrowed from America, where it's actually failed in America. This doesn't show much strategic sense, does it?
I would say that one of the things I've always been uncomfortable about Americanizing our politics. It's the Westmingification of Britain, and it's daft. I mean, do you remember last year the Greens were banging on about an egg shortage? There was no egg shortage, but there was an egg shortage in America.
The left is even more obsessed with American politics than our side.
However, and so yes, I agree with you on the title, but that I mean, it was an idea, the fun idea at the time, and it's stuck. Um, but I think if you saw the work that was done and came out last week on the local authority pension funds, there is a significant amount of money that is being mishandled, misplaced, because it's not being driven by making money for their pensioners. It's being driven by shoring up governmental policy on wind farms and things of this sort. Now, some of that work that was done, that Richard Tice was able to present very effectively last week, was done by the DOGE teams. Um, Now, as I say, I agree with you on the name. I think it's daft. And because it ties itself to, as you say, and I would agree, at best a very limited success, if worse, the disaster for the Trump administration. But the idea of going in and checking what is actually being spent line by line when you are a new administration is a good idea in itself.
I would agree.
And in that, they've discovered, and because of Richard's interest in the city and all the rest of it, we were aware prior to this that these pension funds are being handled not for the benefit of their pensioners, but for the benefit of governmental policy
Or the taxpayer.
or the taxpayer. And because, of course, if those pensions underperform, the ratepayer, the council taxpayer, has to top it up. Whereas if they overperform, the ratepayer pays less. And so, therefore, if you can improve the performance of those things, which I almost certainly can, then everybody wins. So I think the work of this unit, though misnamed, and that I agree is not helpful, has already shown itself to have great value. And we also, I mean, reforms policy is to remove social care from councils. It is not fair on local councils to be given open-ended costs on a statutory basis. It is just not fair.
I agree. It's mad. I mean, the whole way we handle our finances at both local and national level is mad. But do you think again that reform, and it doesn't seem to me that this has yet happened, reform has not yet shown a full recognition of the crisis in our public finances, has it? This seems to me to be an area where you really have to step forward. It is quite clear the drumbeat of 30-year gilts at the interest rates at their highest levels, the fact that the figures slightly vary. It's either £1 in every 12 or £1 in every 10 that's raised in taxes, goes on interest rates, and so on. We are now actually borrowing to pay interest on our national debt.
Borrowing to pay debt is mad.
This means very grim policies, doesn't it? And reform so far has shown no sign of grasping the big nettles. It took the line of defending pensioners, rich pensioners like me, receiving the winter fuel allowance. They're on the side of the triple lock. Now, these are things. Aren't you on the side of the triple lock?
Nigel has been asked in press conferences twice in the last month, will you guarantee the triple lock? And he has refused to guarantee it on both occasions.
That is very interesting. Do you know what? That I had not been aware of that. That is really interesting. Gawain, this is the sort of thing that needs to be said more clearly. That would mean he is as far as I know, the only leading politician actually to have
Correct.
dared to say that.
And he hasn't said he'll abolish it, but he hasn't said he will guarantee to keep it.
Now I think that's a moment at which we could pause, because those seem to me, again, they're parts of an essential process of definition. Remember, one of the signs, we were talking about this political realignment, was that reform was going to go in the direction which people like Rod Liddle or Maurice Glassman talk about as blue Labour. That's to say, right on cultural matters, right on family, faith, and flag. Though I don't see much sign of faith in Nigel, I'm delighted to say, for all the reasons that we talked about, but leftish on economics. And we all know leftish economics are the end. That the whole notion that there is a magic money tree, that we can continue doing what Gordon Brown did. Gordon Brown, quite deliberately, this is why free television licenses for the elderly were introduced by Brown, why the winter fuel allowance was introduced by Brown, why families with under, I think it was up to 100,000, were able to claim child benefit. It was his idea that you bound the welfare state in by making sure everybody benefited from it. This is totally unsustainable. And if Nigel, you've told me, I of course believe you, Nigel's refusal to say that he is fully committed to the triple lock is of absolutely central importance. I think we should stop here because we're both going to continue this conversation at the Reform Conference. I will try and come to your events, you can come to mine, and we can continue there.
Absolutely, David.
A pleasure.
A great pleasure indeed. Again.